I'm Mark English, Strategic and Policy Advisor to EM. What I'm going to say is to give the usual disclaimer, personal views. And I'm going to make 3 propositions, and I'm going to try to show why they're all true. If you can't hear me or if I'm speaking too loudly, then do signal from the back. First proposition, both the UK and the EU are in dire conditions, politically, economically, and socially. Second proposition, for the UK, a closer relationship with the EU is essential. Otherwise, things can only get worse. The third proposition, a closer relationship with the EU or with the UK rather, can improve the EU's chances of recovery. And that picks up on some of the earlier remarks that have been made by Dominic Grieve and others. If the UK brings a positive mindset to the table. I don't need to dwell on the UK situation for the people in this room. We can all see how Brexit is going. Negative growth per capita in 2024. More spending cuts in the pipeline next month. A fifth of the UK population in poverty. And falling trade confirmed again this week by the Office of National Statistics. Also newly worrying signs in the labour market considering the employment situation. And worst of all, the Reform Party leading in some opinion polls. But we need to look at Europe without rose-tinted glasses too. There are gathering economic headwinds with government debt and deficits falling out of control. The German economy has stagnated. A bitter election campaign is in progress amidst a series of terrorist attacks. The far-right AfD is poised to score around 20% of the vote and possibly more. Severe public spending cuts and/or tax increases are coming down the line in France, in Belgium, in Italy, and beyond. This is likely to feed further social unrest and further support for the far right. Meanwhile, at institutional level, the EU is riven by divisions over everything from how to deal with Putin, with Trump, with China, to whether or not to abandon its once ambitious climate goals. Far-right and/or authoritarian parties, in effect, lead governments in Italy, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Slovakia. Austria was saved this week, but could yet go the same way. The rerun Romanian presidential election could still yield a far-right president. The far right holds government positions in Poland. Yes, they still hold the presidency, elections coming soon. In Finland, in Croatia, and the Czech Republic. The Swedish government is dependent on the far-right Sweden Democrats to stay in power. In France, the far right is polling at about 40%, with a Le Pen, or worse, and believe me, it would be worse, Bardella presidency in 2027, a live possibility. Even in Spain and Portugal, which suffered far-right dictatorships in living memory, the far-right Vox and Chega parties are on around 15%. Meanwhile, well over a fifth of members of the European Parliament are from the far right. And on a more micro level, anyone who has been to Charleroi in Belgium, to the shantytown of Cañada Real, just outside Madrid, to whole swathes of the Parisian suburbs, knows that some parts even of Western Europe suffer from problems of poverty, decay, division, racism, drugs, and violence, as bad or worse than in the reddest of UK Red Wall towns. So, there must be no simplistic UK bad, Europe good content in our messaging. First, because that is factually untenable, even absurd as a position. Second, because an iron law of politics, and we have some politicians here, is that no party or campaign seen as unpatriotic will ever succeed. And I'll refer you to Caroline Lucas's book, Another England, for some ideas on how we can be both patriotic and pro-European. So I think I've established my first premise. The UK and the EU are both in a terrible mess. What about the second? For the UK, a closer relationship with the EU is urgent. Excuse me. The Office of Budget Responsibility estimates a 4% hit to the UK economy because of Brexit. But it won't end there. What we face is an accelerating downward spiral. The more British businesses fall out of EU supply chains, the more likely it is that even more will fall out. The more our export base is eroded, the weaker what remains will be. The European economy may recover. There are some green shoots, there are some signs of that. And even if not, those markets will still account for half of our trade. And if growth in the EU does remain stagnant and demand is squeezed, that is not an argument for Brexit. Indeed, it's costlier contracts with non-EU suppliers that are likely to be swept away first if European businesses need to cut costs. So growth will fluctuate. The UK will be up, France will be up, Germany will be up, but one simple fact will not change. Brexit makes it much harder for any business in Birmingham to supply customers in Berlin than it is for an equivalent business in Bucharest, in Bilbao or Bratislava to do so, all the Bs. So good times or bad in the EU, Brexit remains a lose-lose for the UK. And there's another reason the cost of Brexit will increase. The European Union is changing. And for all the divisions, there's one two-word phrase on which there is something approaching unity. Ursula von der Leyen's recent speeches are full of it. She's echoed by Macron, by Donald Tusk, even by Meloni. That phrase is strategic autonomy. In other words, the self-sufficiency of the EU. This means the European Union ending its dependence on unpredictable jurisdictions, including the big one across the Atlantic. It means ensuring access to critical raw materials, pooling investment in green technology, common procurement of key medicines, defence procurement rules favouring EU businesses, building an EU capital market to rival the City of London. If the UK falls completely outside these EU initiatives, not just the economic cost, but the human cost of Brexit could soar further. Imagine another pandemic where massive EU procurement power hoovered up the supply of critical treatments. And the European Union invited the UK to be part of the HERA Medicines Initiative, and the UK said no. That brings me to my third and last premise, that a closer relationship with the UK could help the EU to deal with what von der Leyen has called a hyper-transactional world, the world of Vance's ridiculous speech yesterday. Put simply, the EU has more chance of being strategically autonomous, of acting as a counterweight to Trump and China, if the UK's weight is on Europe's side of the scales. This is obvious. But the UK has to make choices. First, we have to choose Europe to be our special relationship. But I'm afraid we also have to choose sides in Europe. And with apologies to Train Spotting and Irvine Welsh, choose Ukraine, choose democracy, choose the rule of law, choose trade, choose protecting the planet, choose tolerance and openness, choose cultural exchange, choose European values. I might be done for copyright by Irvine Welsh if I write it down, I think. Far from everyone in the European Union is making those choices. Let's be clear about that. But if those dark forces prevail, as I think somebody said from the floor earlier, Europe won't be worth having. And progressive forces in the UK will be left horribly isolated. So it's no good hedging our bets. The UK government has nothing to lose by lining up clearly and solidly with the majority, and it is still a majority, from von der Leyen and many others on the conservative centre-right through to democratic socialists that stick fast to European values. The government should be showing our European partners how the UK can contribute to this Europe of values and of prosperity. On defence, the government is making the right choices. You will have noticed on Wednesday, and Emma referred to this, when Trump announced his cosy chat with Vladimir Putin, that the UK was a signatory to the joint robust response of the 5 biggest EU defence powers. This was an example of the UK playing a constructive role in Europe and of Europe being better for that. Both sides want a closer defence and security relationship, and it will happen. Let's look next at trade. I think this is underestimated as a benefit for the EU. A good trading relationship with the UK is very important for the EU. Of course it is. Think how much effort the European Union is currently putting into a trade deal with Mercosur, Latin America, collectively only the EU's 10th biggest trading partner. The UK is the EU's 2nd biggest trading partner, with 13% of EU exports going to the UK. That's second only to the US for now. Trade prospects with the US are not looking great at the moment for Europe. The EU is not going to risk undermining the single market by giving the UK privileges equal to or exceeding those available to EU members. There will be no mutual recognition of regulations leading to the blanket removal of border checks. That's how the single market works inside and not how it relates to external partners. That said, EU companies can benefit significantly from improvements to trade with the UK. For example, from including the UK in the Pan-Euro Mediterranean Customs Convention. Relatively easy to negotiate insofar as easy exists in these kind of negotiations. And the EU can benefit from a food safety deal, sometimes known as an SPS or veterinary deal, though that won't be so easy to negotiate, and it will need the UK government to stand up to UK media caterwauling about rule-taking, vassal states, etc. How borrowing some EU rules that stop people dying of food poisoning makes the UK a vassal state is a bit hard to understand, frankly. Lastly, defence against climate meltdown is as important as defence against military aggression. Here, what Europe needs from the UK is both action, sticking to our own British net zero goals and the policies that will get us there, and political support in international fora, notably against Trump. As a start, the UK should apply to rejoin the European Environment Agency. It would be welcomed with open arms. And I have no doubt that the next panelists will have more to say on a more knowledgeable basis than I can about that. The English language and education and culture in the English language is huge soft power for the UK, whether via youth mobility, Erasmus, or the UK returning to the Creative Europe programme. It's blindingly obvious that closer ties in this area mean big opportunities for Brits, particularly younger ones. And in addition, one of the best inoculations against the far right, whether on the Essex coast or in Eastern Germany, is giving young people the opportunity to travel and experience different cultures. Of course, the exact terms of a youth mobility scheme will need hard-nosed negotiating. but the government should be shouting its welcome for the principle and offering to start negotiations immediately. So I hope I've proved the three premises. The UK and the EU are both bogged down. The UK won't stop sinking unless it gets closer to the EU, but if it does, EU-UK partnership can also help the EU to turn things around. Now, let's not slag off the government. That gets us nowhere. Let's urge it forcefully to be more ambitious, to frame positively how the UK can contribute to the EU meeting its own challenges. Let's make a patriotic case for the UK moving back towards the heart of Europe. Of course, we should never resile from our ultimate aim of rejoining the EU, as Emma has made extremely clear. But as Emma has also made extremely clear, that will not happen suddenly from a standing start. An EU official told me last week that it would take even Iceland, already in the single market and a highly trusted partner, years of negotiations to join. So we need to be realistic. The UK's best and fastest route back to the heart of Europe, as our strategy lays out, is to make itself as useful as possible to the pro-European core in its hour of need, the pro-European core in the EU. Starting now, which does mean the UK government making some bold choices. And our job is to campaign for those bold but realistic choices. If we succeed, the reset can be the beginning of a rebuilding process. It can be a reinvigoration. And if we succeed, the reset can just be the beginning. So that's what I think we need to focus on. Thank you for listening.